To get the clearest picture of these lives, we
To get the clearest picture of these lives,
don't just send them questionnaires.
we just don't send them questionnaires.
We interview them in their living rooms. We get their medical records from their doctors. We draw their blood. We scan their brains. We talk to their children. We videotape them talking with their wives about their deepest concerns. And when about a decade ago we finally asked the wives if they would join us as members of the study, many of the women said, you know, it's about time. So what have we learned?
So what you've learned?
From the 10
What are the lessons that come from the tens of thousands of pages?
of thousands of pages of information that we've generated on these lives. Well, the lessons aren't about wealth or fame
The lessons aren't about wealth or fame,
or working harder and harder. The clearest message that we get from this 75-year study is
the clear message we get from this 75 years that we get from this 75-year study is this:
this. Good relationships keep us happier and healthier.
good relationships keep us happier and wealthier.
Period. We've learned 3 big lessons about relationships.
We've learned 3 big lessons about relationships.
The first is that social connections are really good for us,
The first is the social connections that are really good for us,
and that loneliness kills.
and the loneliness kills. Okay.
It turns out that people who are more socially connected
It turns out that people who are more socially connected
to family, to friends, to community,
to family, to friends, to community
are happier, they're physically healthier,
are happier, they're physically happier,
and they live longer
and they live longer
than people who are less well connected.
than people who are less well connected.
And the experience of loneliness turns out to be toxic.
And the experience of loneliness has turned out to be toxic.
People who are more isolated than they want to be from others
People who are more isolated than they want to be from others
find that they are less happy, their health declines earlier in midlife,
find that they're less happy, their health declines earlier in midlife,
their brain functioning declines sooner, and they live shorter lives
their brain function decline sooner, and they live shorter lives
than people who are not lonely.
than people who are not lonely.
And the sad fact is that at any given time, more than 1 in 5 Americans will report
The sad fact is that at any given time, more than 1 in 5 Americans will report
that they're lonely. And we know that you can be lonely in a crowd and you can be lonely in a marriage.
We know that you can be lonely in a crowd and lonely in a marriage.
So the second big lesson that we learned is that it's not just the number of friends you have, and it's not whether or not you're in a committed relationship.
But so the second big lesson we've learned is that it's not just the number of friends you have, and it's not whether you're in a committed relationship.
But it's the quality of your close relationships.
It's the quality of your close relationships.
That matters.
That matters.
It turns out that living in the midst of conflict is really bad for our health.
It turns out living in the midst of a conflict is really bad for our health.
High conflict marriages, for example,
High conflict marriages, for example,
without much affection,
without much
turn
affection,
out to be very bad for our health, perhaps worse than getting divorced.
turns out to be very bad for our health, or even worse than getting divorced.
And living in the midst of good, warm relationships is protective.
Living in the midst of good relationship is protective.
Once we had followed our men all the way into their 80s, we wanted to look back at them at midlife.
Once we follow our men all the way into their 80s, we wanted to look back at midlife
And to see if we could predict who was going to grow into a happy, healthy octogenarian.
and predict. To see if we could predict who's gonna grow into a happy, healthy octogenarian
and who wasn't.
and who was an octogenarian.
And when we gathered together, everything we knew about them
And when we gathered together, everything we knew about them
at age 50,
at age 50,
it wasn't their middle-aged cholesterol levels that predicted how they were going to grow old.
it wasn't their level of, it wasn't their middle-aged cholesterol levels that predict how they're going to grow old.
It was how satisfied they were in their relationships.
It was how they were satisfied, how to say satisfied they were in their relationship.
People who were the most satisfied in their relationships
People who were the most satisfied in their relationship
at age 50 were the healthiest at age 80.
were the healthiest at age 80.
And good, close relationships seem to buffer us from some of the slings and arrows of getting old.
And good close relationships seem to buffer us from some of the slings and arrows of getting old. Slings and arrows getting old. Slings and arrows getting old. Slings and arrows of getting old.
Our most happily partnered men and women
Our most happily partnered men and women
reported in their 80s that on
report in their 80s.
the days when they had more physical pain, their moods stayed just as happy.
On the days when they had more physical pain, their mood stayed just as happy.
But the people who were in unhappy relationships,
But people who were in unhappy relationship,
on the days when they reported more physical pain,
on the days they reported more physical pain,
it was magnified
it was magnified
by more emotional pain.
by emotional pain.
And the third big lesson that we learned
And the third big lesson we've learned
about relationships and our health is that good
about relationships and our health is that
relationships don't just protect our bodies,
good relationships don't just protect our body.
they protect our brains.
It protects our brains.
It turns out that being in a securely attached relationship
It turns out that being in a securely attached relationship
to another person in your 80s
to another person in your 80s
is protective. That the people who are in relationships where they really feel they can count on the other person in time,
that the people who are in relationships where they would really feel they can count on the other person in times of need,
times of need, those people's memories stay sharper longer.
those people's memory stay sharper longer.
And the people in relationships where they feel they really can't count on the other one,
And people in a relationship where they feel really can't count on the other,
those are the people who experience earlier memory decline.
those are the people who experience earlier memory decline.
And those good relationships, they don't have to be smooth all the time. Some of
Those good relationships they don't have in those and those good relationships they don't have to be smooth all the time.
our octogenarian couples could bicker with each other day in and day out.
Some of our octogenarian couples could bicker with each other day in and day out.
But as long as they felt that they could really count on the other when the going got tough,
But as long as they felt they could really count on the other when the going got tough,
those arguments didn't take a toll on their memories.
those arguments didn't take a toll on their memories.
So, this message that good, close relationships are good for our health and well-being.
So this message is that good healthy relationship is good for our health and well-being.
This is wisdom that's as old as the hills.
This is the wisdom that just as old as the hills. As old as the hills. As old as the hills. Very old, exactly as old as the hills.
Why is this so hard to get and so easy to ignore?
Why is this so hard to get and so easy to ignore?
Well, we're human. What we'd really like is a quick fix.
What we really like is a quick fix.
Something we can get
Something we can get
that'll make our lives good and keep them that way.
that'll make our lives good and keep them the way.
Relationships are messy and they're complicated, and the hard work of tending to family and friends,
Relationships are hard, messy, and they're complicated. And the hard work of tending to family and friends.
it's not sexy or glamorous.
It's not sexy or glamorous.
It's also lifelong.
It's also lifelong.
It never ends. The people in our 75-year study who were the happiest in retirement
The people in our study who are the happiest in retirement
were the people who had actively worked to replace workmates
were the people who actively work to replace workmates
with new playmates.
with new playmates.
Just like the millennials in that recent survey,
Just like the millennials in their recent survey,
many of our men, when they were starting out as young adults,
many of our men, when they are starting out as a young adults,
really believed that fame and wealth and high achievement were what they needed to go after.
really believe fame, achievement, and status is what they needed to go after
To have a good life.
to have a good life.
But over and over these 75 years, our study has shown
But over and over, over these 75 years, our study has shown
that the people who fared the best
that the people who fared the best,
were the people who leaned into relationships
were the people who lean into a relationship
with family, with friends, with community. So what about you? Let's say you're 25, or you're 40, or you're 60.
Let's say you're 25, 40, or 60.
What might leaning into relationships even look like?
What might leaning into relationships even look like?
Well, the possibilities are practically endless.
Well, possibilities are practically endless.
It might be something as simple as replacing screen time with people time.
It might be simple as replacing screen time with people time.
Or livening up a stale relationship by doing something new together.
Livening up a stale relationship by doing something new together.
Long walks or date nights.
Long walks or date nights.
Or reaching out to that family member who you haven't spoken to in years.
Or reaching out to those family members you haven't spoken to in years.
Because those all too common family feuds
Because all too common family feuds
take a terrible toll on the people who hold the grudges.
take a terrible toll on the people who hold the grudges.
I'd like to close with a quote from Mark Twain.
I'd like to close with a quote from Mark Twain.
More than a century ago, he was looking back on his life
more than a century ago, he was looking back his own life,
and he wrote this.
and he wrote this.
There isn't time. So brief is life.
There isn't time, so brief is life.
For bickerings, apologies, heartburnings, callings to account.
For bickerings. Bickering, apologies, heartburnings, cold account. To say that someone is responsible for something that has gone wrong and expect them to explain it to cold account.
There is only time for loving,
There's only time for loving,
and but an instant, so to speak, for that. The good life
but an instant, so to speak, for that.
is built with good relationships.
The good life is built with good
Thank
relationship.
you.